every insecure attachment style has activating and deactivating strategies to get their needs met in relationships. For anxious attachers, those activation strategies revolve around bringing someone closer to essentially close the gap between them and someone else. For avoidant attachers, those deactivating strategies often revolve around creating space between them and the other person. Hello, my name is Charlie, and welcome to my channel where I talk about all things attachment styles and no contact. Today, I'm going to be discussing 5 ways avoidant attachers deactivate within relationships. So why do avoidants deactivate? Well, usually some sort of trigger happens within the relationship that causes them to interpret fear, risk, and judgment, and so they consequently pull away. It's essentially why they choose to seek space, because chances are at some point growing up in life, they perceived space as a good thing. Take, for example, if you grew up in an emotionally abusive household where your caregivers taught you that asking for your own needs and validating yourself was bad. Naturally, you would begin to realize that those caregivers weren't there to provide emotional safety and connection. So indirectly, you learn that space is good. Being vulnerable is bad because when you are vulnerable, when you do stand up for yourself and communicate your own needs, you're going to be shamed, judged, and guilt-tripped for putting too much pressure on other people. So that is essentially what creates the avoidant attachment style, and it's essentially why many avoidant attachers perceive space as a go-to solution whenever stress comes up in their life and in relationships. So you might be wondering, what are the triggers that cause avoidants to pull away and seek space? Well, simply put, every individual avoidant person has their own unique triggers, and how they show up in their life will affect them to varying degrees. However, here are some of the most common triggers within avoidant people. Perceiving when a partner wants to get too close, or being in a connection that feels like it takes up too much of your time. Some other triggers can include unpredictable or inconsistent situations or relationship dynamics that leave avoidants feeling out of control. They feel like they can't control the outcome of those relationships, and therefore that can be quite triggering for them. Also, feeling as though you lean on other people too much or you rely on them too much can be triggering, but then also feeling as though your partners ask too much of you can be triggering as well. Lastly, receiving criticism that feels harsh, any fears surrounding shame, judgment, or guilt, and then any type of conflict that leaves them feeling inferior can all indirectly make them feel triggered in the end. So here are some of the common deactivating strategies that they'll turn to when these conflicting moments do come up in their life. The first one we've kind of alluded to already, and it's when they create physical distance between them and the other person, but they also limit intimacy between them and the other person. And so this one is pretty self-explanatory because something has come up in the relationship that has caused a rift where they feel maybe inferior or judged or just not good enough. They begin to pull away and seek space so that they can have clarity. And then they can also have a little bit of sense of control over the situation because now suddenly they feel not good enough and out of control, probably just like when they were a child again, if that's the source of where their avoidant attachment came from. The second most common deactivating strategy I find for avoidance is vulnerable detachment. Much like how they create space and distance on a physical level, they can also do that on an emotional level, and that's really what this second deactivating strategy is all about. This is where you might actually find they begin to show signs of being distant, and if you're an anxious attacher, you're probably going to notice a shift in how they behave around you. They might not be as cuddly or warm. They may not put as much effort or emphasis into communicating with you. These are all subtle signs and early signs that they are beginning to deactivate. Additionally, if conflict does come up, they may be less willing to share their side or maybe what they're feeling, and they may be more solution-oriented in order to make you feel good so that they don't necessarily have to be in a state of conflict anymore. They're probably just willing to say whatever it takes in order to end the conversation and to make you feel better, to appease you. And this can be interpreted as another form of people pleasing, but also the fear of conflict. It's kind of stemming from their avoidant tendencies. And because they tend to fear conflict to a degree, they will also not really engage with it and instead kind of just go with the flow. They're more willing to just say whatever it takes and do whatever it takes in order to make you feel happy. And if they feel as though you're not giving them enough information, they're probably just going to start asking you what it is you need in order to feel good. What do you want them to say? What can they do in order to make the situation better? They're more likely in a solution-oriented mindset, but sometimes they're like this because they want to avoid feeling the conflict. They're not necessarily concerned as much about making you feel good and repairing the conflict in order to create connection. They just want to stop the conflict altogether. And that's where it can actually stem from avoidance rather than emotional vulnerability. And that's one of the ways where they actually aren't as emotionally vulnerable in this deactivating strategy, because they're not necessarily doing the things to create connection. They're just doing the things to repair disconnection. And those are two essentially different things. It's one thing to repair disconnection, but it's another thing to then jump off of that and lead into creating connection, which is not what they'll usually do. The third deactivating strategy, and it's one that can be really subtle and sometimes can be misinterpreted for vulnerability, but it's when they begin to doubt the relationship. Now, how they share these doubts with you will be very important to consider. Sometimes they'll share it out of the blue, and sometimes they'll share it after a big dramatic event has taken place. So first, when they share it out of the blue, like for example, if you're both just hanging out, maybe watching a movie and cuddling, and they start to feel kind of emotional, they may start to say things like, "You deserve someone better," or "I don't think I'm good enough for you, and I don't think I can love you enough." In that context, it's really easy for anxious attachers to misinterpret this sign sometimes, because they'll interpret it as them being vulnerable, them sharing a sign of vulnerability. And while that is true, there is a certain level of vulnerability to share this, but they could be doing it because they are deactivating and they are rationalizing this as a reason as to why they should ultimately pull away. And so this is why sometimes in my sessions, anxious attachers will say that their avoidant was sharing these details with them about not being good enough or that they deserve someone better, only to then later break up with them and them not realize that they had been deactivating the whole time. So this can be a really subtle sign if it's brought up in this way, because they might be thinking of already leaving the connection and they're trying to justify certain reasons as to why they're not good enough and why they don't deserve to be in that connection to begin with. The other way they can share this information is if when a big explosive argument comes up. If they don't share these feelings for over a long amount of time and certain things like resentment gradually build, they'll likely wait until a big explosive fight happens in order to feel vulnerable enough to actually share this with you. And this is when they'll share things like, "I'm not good enough for you. I never make you happy. Nothing I do is good enough." And really it stems from a wound of not being good enough, which I'll actually dive into very soon. But essentially it's their way of pairing these fears and concerns about not being good enough with the traumatic conflict that's happening in the moment. And when you join those two together, as an avoidant, it kind of makes you think that because you have these feelings and moments at the exact same time, you start to think that the relationship just simply isn't worth it. Again, it's really just another form of them rationalizing why they shouldn't be in the relationship and why they should ultimately pull away to create safety. But they don't always realize that sometimes these fears are simply just extensions of cognitive distortions that they believe in themselves. What a cognitive distortion is any bias or indirect belief about ourselves that simply aren't true. They simply just exist to make us feel bad, fuel anxiety, and create disconnection in our life. And so when these do come up, they will manifest as certain core beliefs about ourselves, and we will sometimes project those onto our relationships if we have an avoidant attachment style. And so when that happens, they'll usually say things like they're just simply not good enough. There's a certain quality to it that they can't simply achieve just by being themselves. And again, it really just stems from different traumatic experiences that happened throughout their life that indirectly taught them that by maybe standing up for themselves or having certain needs or emotional wants, that they didn't deserve to have those things based off of how other people treated them when they requested them. And so when that happens, it indirectly teaches you that you don't deserve to ask for love, security, and connection. And that's what shapes the avoidant attachment, but also the avoidant attachment's core beliefs. So all of this leads me into the next deactivating strategy, and essentially it is an extension of one of their core beliefs, and it's the fear of not being good enough. Now, I kind of touched upon this in the last part, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. Basically, this is an extension of a core belief that they believe about themselves, and it's indirectly trained and taught through the experiences they've had throughout life. Now, sometimes and most commonly, this comes from relationships they've had with their caregivers or people that were at influential stages in their development in life. Now, during these stages, as we grow up, we learn that we are a person, we have needs and wants, and we have to do certain things in order to receive those from other people. Now, depending on how people interpret that and how they're willing to give that to us will dictate whether or not we tend to take on this core belief. So, if at a young age we have emotionally unavailable parents, or just parents that aren't emotionally attuned to themselves and their children, essentially what happens is they will reject their child's bids of connection. They will outright shame them sometimes for being emotional, for crying, or for feeling sad, and tell them that, in the context of men who most commonly are avoidant, they will tell them that men don't cry, men don't feel sad about this, men don't feel that way. And this is essentially what creates avoidant attachment for many of that subsection of society. Now, this can also apply to women and all genders that exist out there, but it's really important to understand that because of that experience that we've had, we indirectly relate that to ourselves and what it means about us as people. Now, those are essentially two different things. We can have an isolated situation happen that brings up ideas of not being good enough, but it's another thing entirely to commit that idea to a core belief about ourselves. And this happens usually over time, repeatedly. It has to happen more than once in order for someone to understand on a deep core level that they are not good enough. And so because they have this belief, they bring that same belief into their adult relationships where usually those same wounds are brought to the surface. Often our romantic relationships are mirrors to our younger self, our inner child, and are great ways of showing the unhealed versions and wounds that we have. So because of these unhealed wounds in relationships, many avoidants will feel as though they're not good enough. They have a fear of not being enough for other people because no matter what they tried in the past was not good enough to receive the love, connection, and commitment that they needed at those times. So that's a really heavy topic, and I understand if you're avoidant or you've dated an avoidant, how this can leave you feeling. So if you are avoidant or you're dating an avoidant who you believe has this fear, it's totally okay to acknowledge and accept that this fear exists. The best way to heal this is to understand that it does exist and acknowledge it. Rather than relying on other strategies like shame and guilt and feeling bad that we are this way and that we aren't good enough, you won't actually be able to heal that. Those strategies of using shame and guilt only make that fear stronger. So you have to actually eliminate any sense of shame or guilt around these core wounds in order to acknowledge them, honor them, and heal them and release them. And so the fifth deactivating strategy that I'm going to cover in this video is when an avoidant begins to overanalyze the connection or the relationship. They start to think very rationally about the relationship, and ultimately it leads them down a path where the relationship just simply won't work out. This all essentially stems from a fear of connection because in the past, connection was scary. And in order to connect with someone, you need to be seen. And to be seen is risky because when you are seen, you're at risk of being judged, shamed, and guilt-tripped. Now, it's important to consider that overanalyzing the connection is simply just them operating out of fear of connection, but I want to honor the people who have been on the receiving end of this. It's really important to acknowledge yourselves and to honor yourselves for being on the receiving end because I know exactly what it can be like to be on the other end of this. Sometimes, as avoidants are overanalyzing connections, they can transition into certain behaviors that are sometimes very harsh, very hurtful, and they're all designed to push people away, to repel them away. And this is one of the earlier deactivating strategies that you can spot in an avoidance behavior. It's when they become very hostile. They're maybe a little bit more agitated and frustrated in life in general. And then they tend to shift that attitude over toward you as their partner. It's where they become very hypercritical of how you show up in the connection or who you are. And they also, in a sense, shame you for the ways in which you show up. Now, receiving this type of treatment, I don't want to say is normal. It certainly should not be accepted and tolerated, but it is important to understand where it comes from because there are certain ways in which this is sometimes understandable as a form of trauma, but then also where it stops being just an excuse of trauma and the avoidant needs to be the one to take accountability. Just because I can understand and rationalize why avoidants do certain behaviors, that isn't to take away from the trauma that comes from dating avoidance. It's important to understand that to an extent, we should rationalize why certain behaviors come up in the context of relationships, but it's also important to honor what it's like to date someone who has to go through this. Now, I know it's not easy to be on the receiving end of harsh criticism, shame, and guilt when an avoidant is deactivating. And if you've been through that or you're going through that, I just want you to know that you're A, not alone, and B, it is something that can be corrected and healed over time, but it is not your job to fix it for them. This is where personal accountability comes into the mix, and these people need to be willing to have a hard conversation, an honest look at themselves, their wounds, their past trauma, but also the ways in which that trauma manifests as behaviors in order to begin having healthier relationships moving forward. And there's only so much you as a partner can do to help someone realize that. Just because you're kind, loving, and caring doesn't mean that's what's going to help them become healed as an avoidant. A lot of the work that's required is actually done internally, and they have to have a lot of perspective changes and rationalizations that take place within that unfortunately sometimes happen when they're not in relationships. So if you see this happening in your relationship now, you're on the receiving end of constant criticism, constant gaslighting, or any type of behavior that just does not feel fair, just know that you do not have to tolerate it. So just because avoidant attachment is created from trauma doesn't necessarily mean their behavior and treatment towards other people is acceptable. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad people. It just simply means that they have some work to do when it comes to attachment, emotional regulation, and intimacy within connections. These are very tangible and core things, and it's not as simple to say that avoidants need to grow up, or they just need to learn how to work on themselves before dating other people. Although for some people, both anxious and avoidants, I think they would both equally benefit from taking time alone in order to heal before being in committed relationships. So it's not just about them being immature or emotionally stunted. It's just simply because certain experiences and behaviors were not modeled for them, and it quite literally has not shaped their brain in a way that allows them to be available for other people in the ways that they need within the context of romantic relationships. By working on themselves, by understanding their wounds, their trauma, how it manifests as behaviors, and learning core skills centered around emotional regulation, they can actually learn how to manage conflict within relationships in a healthy way, and they can actually learn how to have successful relationships. That's a much better way of phrasing how people need to work on themselves than simply just saying that they need to grow up. Because quite simply, approaching attachment healing with these type of notions doesn't actually help people heal. If we want to create a better environment for relationships to exist, we need to begin eliminating judgment, shame, and stigma around insecure attachments, because both anxious and avoidant attachment styles have their core issues. So when I say all of this, I am not asking you to forgive them. I am certainly not asking you to tolerate certain treatment and abuse that can be explained through the lens of trauma. But what I am asking you is to essentially begin to understand that the reason anxious and avoidant attachment styles exist is because of generational trauma that's done from one generation to the next. There's also other reasons why they exist, but if we can learn to look at these both equally in their own unique ways, we can begin to empathize with them, we can create a better environment for them to flourish, but also we can eliminate other elements like shame and judgment that often leave people stuck in these attachment styles. And with all of that said, it's important to understand that attachment styles exist on a spectrum. Not all avoidants are so bad, and not all anxious attachers are overly clingy. Everybody has different degrees into which their attachment style shows up within relationships. And as they begin to become more secure, that will begin to change as well. It's very fluid in that sense. Your attachment style can change whether you're in a supportive relationship or you're doing the work outside of one that supports a healthier dynamic within. I truly do believe in order to understand severe anxious and avoidant attachment, you also have to understand severe trauma and abuse. Often, these attachment styles are simply just extensions of severe personality disorders like maybe narcissistic personality disorder, BPD, or bipolar disorder, but then also complex trauma like CPTSD. This isn't just an isolated issue, it's often related to a greater trauma that's taken place in life, and this is simply just a symptom of those other issues. It's really important to be more empathetic with all attachment styles. It's important to be understanding of how they're created and how they manifest as behaviors within relationships. And if we can be there for them in a way where we offer true love that is free of judgment, shame, and guilt, with essentially no requirements and obligations, then we can actually create an environment where they can feel like they're safe enough to heal. So I hope you found this video insightful and helpful. If you received any value from it, then please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Additionally, feel free to check out the links below. I have a free no-contact journal that you can download, but also links to work with me directly. If you're interested in learning more about avoidant attachment, then feel free to check out these suggested videos. Happy healing, and I'll see you in the next video.